We're going to look at now, continuing on with our investigation into the reasons for European imperialism in the late 19th century. We're going to be doing part 3 of this, and that is the emergence of new imperialism. And that's our next bullet point, our next subtopic for this unit. So, the nature of new imperialism. So, we're going to be talking about this thing called new imperialism. So, pretty much, new imperialism is different than the past imperialism. Previous imperialism was based on mercantilism, which we learned about last week. So the geographic scope, so looking at where this new imperialism is focused at is also different. So this is centered on Africa and Asia. Africa is really important because it had a lot of valuable minerals, especially rubber and tin, which are going to be very sought after by Europeans. And then when you add in gold and diamonds, it makes it very, very appealing to go to Africa. And then when you have China, China was struggling internally and politically. There's been failed revolutions. The empire of China was crumbling. So a lot of European nations viewed China as being rather weak and vulnerable, and they wanted to make sure that they not only just took advantage of that, but that they did not lose access to any of the silk or tea that they had. Additionally, another aspect of new imperialism was that it helped maintain peaceful relations, actually. New imperialism was seen as a way to prevent war between the European countries. They were to play out their rivalries externally in the colonial sense without actually threatening war within Europe. And you get that with the Treaty of Berlin, written in 1885, which we're going to be learning about in a couple of days, which actually divided Africa and split it up between all the European powers to prevent wars occurring over these colonies. And also it set up the rules for how Europeans were expected to behave in terms of colonization. Next is in China, you got this ability to maintain peaceful relations, because what these European nations did, and actually you can add the United States to this as well, is they worked together to create these things referred to as spheres of influence. Within these spheres of influence, each country had their part of China that they controlled entirely. And in fact, these European nations actually and America agreed to work with each other against Chinese interests. So whenever a rebellion occurred in China trying to overthrow European and foreign influence, the countries of Europe and the United States, within Europe and the United States, banded together to actually put down the Chinese rebellion. Also, within new imperialism, you get new imperial countries for the first time. That these are the main European powers. They're still involved, but now you get Germany and Italy starting to come into play with imperialism. You still had the same old ones, like you had Britain and France, but Spain drops out as being an imperial country. Portugal's still kind of there, but not really, and the Netherlands really drops out. But so you get Germany and Italy are the two big ones that join the scene as far as Europe. The United States also becomes an imperial country at this time period, and this occurs when the United States begins taking interest in Central and South America. So the United States isn't really coming into play at all with Africa. However, when it comes to Central and South America, the United States is a really big participant in imperialism. And then also Japan decides that they want to modernize so they are not taken over by European powers through imperialism, and they themselves become an imperial nation, and you really start getting that buildup leading up to World War II. So there's a couple of things that actually enabled new imperialism to occur. The first is medical advancements. We're going to be focusing more here on Africa now. So Africa was nicknamed the white man's grave because there were a lot of diseases that were in Africa that Europeans had never experienced before. And the main European illness that allowed them to really take over the Americas, smallpox, the Africans had smallpox, so they had immunity to it. So there was no biological advantage that Europeans had going to Africa. However, Africa had malaria and a lot of other, mostly mosquito-borne illnesses that were not present in Africa or in Europe. So that gained Europe or Africa the nickname white man's grave. That was until the invention of quinine, which was developed by French scientists in 1817. Originally, it was realized that this was a successful and effective malaria treatment, which was the main disease that was killing Europeans. So with the development of quinine, which by the way is in tonic water, and other medical advancements, Europeans weren't as afraid of traveling into Africa and Asia. So without that fear of dying, this made your Africa a lot more accessible to Europeans. Next, we have technological advancements that helped advance new imperialism. The big one here is the Industrial Revolution. With the advancement of the Industrial Revolution and the development of steel using the Bessemer process, which the Bessemer process is a way to make steel a lot better and a lot cheaper. You get steel, which allows the development of railways and steamships. This is important because before, the African continent wasn't really accessible outside of the coast. The horses were killed easily through specific diseases that were in Africa, so there really was no way for Europeans to travel into the interior of Africa. Now, with railways and steamships, they can travel across Africa and up into the African River, so that makes it far more accessible. And weapons are greatly advanced during the new imperialism time period in the 1800s. Rifles become significantly more advanced, and you get machine guns and artillery become advanced. During the initial period of old imperialism, so to speak, whenever Europeans were really getting into the Americas, guns and rifles really helped them, whereas in Africa, the guns weren't really useful because they didn't have the advantage of horseback, which allowed them to escape quickly. Because remember, the guns took forever to load, so they didn't have that advantage whenever they couldn't use horses. So they had to fight with the old-fashioned way with swords, and Africans had swords and spears and were just as just as fine a job as fighting. So Africa wasn't really colonized during this initial period. However, with rifle technology and machine guns, this allowed Europeans to easily defeat African armies, despite the fact that they were greatly outnumbered by the native Africans. One of the big events here was the Matabele War of 1893, which really showed the impact of British artillery, despite how insanely outnumbered they were, that they were able to easily defeat an African army here. And next up is communications, as being a big technological advancement. The telegraph specifically made it to where you could control your colonies from overseas. So the British government could control what was happening in their African colonies from home based off of telegraph machines. So they were able to really control their empires here. Additionally, another key feature of new imperialism was actually opposition to slavery. There was not a big rush to go to Africa in order to claim slaves. In fact, it was actually the opposite. So by 1820, most European nations don't have slaves. They're actually opposed to the slave trade. But however, slavery was still very common in Africa. So there was this idea from a lot of Europeans that it was their moral duty to enter into Africa and put an end to the practice of slavery within the continent of Africa. Now, don't get too excited or think too highly of Europeans for that one. It wasn't really out of the kindness of their heart they were doing. There was this big theory of racial superiority that was quite prevalent in Europe and actually America at this time, which, I think it still is there, but this was ingrained into scientific belief. So you get scientists Friedrich Blumenbach and Joseph Arthur Comte de Gobineau, who developed a classification for races, and they claimed that the white race was superior to every other race, and they justified this theory based on Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, this would be where Charles Darwin developed his idea that evolution occurred. So these racial superiority scientists argued that Darwin's theory of evolution showed that white people were more evolved than Africans, or any other race actually, that white people were at the top. And because of this idea that they were racially superior, Europeans especially believed that they needed to bring stability and civilization to African and Asian peoples. So they refer to this as white man's burden. This actually comes from a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling was the author of The Jungle Book. So this is this idea that these people need, it is the burden of white men, not or white people, but especially men, to enlighten and civilize other people, that because white people are so much more civilized, it is their duty and responsibility, it is their burden to try to lift up other peoples. So that's why it's man's burden. And you also got people like David Livingstone, who was a famous Christian missionary, and also other Christian missionaries at the time that believed that they needed to spread Christianity to the African people. This comes along with that racial superiority aspect, that it was the job of the European to bring the Africans and Asians to what David Livingstone referred to as the 3 C's: commerce, Christianity, and civilization. So with this, the Europeans actually argued that, or attempted to argue that, the reason why, with colonizing these areas, what they were actually doing was helping the people out. That, however, the Europeans were really actually self-interested. They weren't really there to help people out. In Britain, you had Lord Lugard, who noted that the main interest was enhancing trade, but he argued that there wasn't a problem with Britain being in Africa to make themselves richer. That wasn't a problem, but he said, let's not pretend pretty much that we're there to help the African people out. That's not what we're there for. We're there for economic purposes, and that's fine. In Germany, had Auguste Bebel, who noted that colonization always exploits native populations. And he said this, however, is fine because Germany had a cultural mission. So yeah, it's fine you're exploiting native populations because there's a great cultural mission that our people have, and that's what this involves.